Thank you, Acting President. Well, I have to say one thing, Mr Lean, you are, if nothing else, entertaining. And you did bring up a couple of points that I was going to mention myself, and that's the original drafting of this motion and the way in which it was worded, condemning something that hasn't actually happened, which I thought was a bit suspicious myself, and I'm very glad to see that Mr O'Sullivan has in fact redrafted that into something that is quite an impressive motion and a very, very important one, and one that we have laboured on quite a lot in this chamber, possibly too much for what seems to be something that is very simple to understand and something that we shouldn't have to labour on these points too much. And I too, Mr Lynn, was perplexed when I read that same article covering the views of Mr Guy, the Leader of the Opposition, and I was wondering where the political fallback would come on that one, and you've provided it today. I've certainly explored ideas of how I can implement that myself, but I've not needed to. But it is good to see Mr O'Sullivan with his convictions today, standing up to whoever may stop him from pressing forward with this motion and pressing forward with the opposition's opposition to the Great Forest National Park. And it is important to continue to note that this is just a proposal. It is not actually a national park as of yet, and hopefully never will be. But it is important to note, because we all talk about the Great Forest National Park, and for anyone who may be reading this later or listening now, it's important that they know that it is a proposal we are talking about, not in fact something that has been put into place. But this motion, which now opposes, calls on the House to oppose the creation of the Great Forest National Park in Victoria, is actually something that we've dealt with a number of times, but we've dealt with very, very well with a previous motion that was put up calling for a moratorium on the creation of the Great Forest National Park, and that was a motion put up myself. The Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party believe that this is one of the key threats to the area in terms of a lot of the things that a lot of the people that we represent, and a lot of the activities being industry or recreational that take place in those areas, and it's very much a threatening thing to the lifestyles of individuals who live in those areas. So it's been an important part of our platform and a great motivation of my time here to make sure that this park never goes ahead. So it's great to see a reiteration of my former motion calling on a moratorium that did a number of things, and this motion, although goes towards the same point, it very much focuses on one aspect of my previous motion from last year, and that's the impact on the industry. But there are a number of other impacts that have to be talked about, and some of them Ms Dunn has touched on, but unfortunately not a lot, and people seem to lose sight of the wider implications of such a park and what it would do. They lose sight of the fact that not only is this going to have damning impacts on an industry that is actually one of the sustainable industries we have, but it actually ranges into other things and other ways in which our livelihoods will be affected. So the previous motion that I in fact put to the chamber was to touch on not only industry, which I'll probably leave aside a little bit in my contribution today, being laboured upon very well by Mr O'Sullivan, and I thank him for making those points, and somewhat countered by Mr Lane. But my motion previously also focused on recreational impacts that would be created, that would be put in place by the creation of a Great Forest National Park, the risk of bushfire, which has been somewhat laboured on today, and the problems with pest animals. In terms of recreation, that's something that really is only made aware of, people are only really made aware of it when they're involved in those recreations, and it seems to be one of those things these days where someone will have an issue with a proposal such as this having a great impact on what they're doing, and if you're not involved in recreations that actually are affected by it, you often don't know about it, and support can be drummed up for these proposals without people knowing the actual impacts of what's going to happen. It's very easy to run a campaign asking pointed questions. Do you support the creation of a Great Forest National Park? Because it will save the leadbeater's possum. And, you know, who wouldn't want to save the leadbeater's possum? But you have to ask the questions that underlie that, as whether the leadbeater's possum is actually threatened, whether the Great Forest National Park will save the leadbeater's possum, What other implications are we going to be putting in place as a result of the Grey Forest National Park? How many thousands of jobs will be lost? How many recreational activities will no longer be able to be participated in? What risk it will have on bushfire management and preparedness, and in the case of a catastrophic event, what impact bushfire will have on people's lives and livelihoods, and the problems created by pest animals in national parks. These are the questions that aren't explored when a simple poll is done: would you support the creation of the Grey Forest National Park to save the leadbeater's possum? And everyone gets a warm fuzzy feeling about it, thinks they're doing something good, when in actual fact they're not. So it brings us to the question why we're looking at this proposal, and this proposal has been going on for some time, and I want to be very clear that this proposal is not about saving the leadbeater's possum. It's a front. This proposal is about destroying the timber industry by people who are ideologically opposed to the timber industry. They don't like it, so they want to stop it. And it's not fair to simply want to stop something because you don't like it. But it's very curious when we have a campaign such as this centred around a leadbeater's possum, because I have no doubt that there's other endangered species in the area. There's probably some endangered arachnids, maybe even an indigenous slug that's in need of some protection. But you don't see those kind of things at the forefront of a campaign because they're not cute and fluffy. They don't tug at the heartstrings of people. And it's no different than when a campaign's run against, say, duck hunting, using images of little baby ducklings that are all fluffy and cute in your propaganda, when in actual fact they're never at risk from duck hunting anyway. That's why we have seasons at certain times of the year to avoid that, we don't hunt little baby ducks. It's that simple. But they're used in propaganda, and this entire debate about a Grey Forest National Park has been very, very well run using that kind of propaganda, because we have a lovely fluffy animal that we can put up in front of everyone, and when you ask that pointed question in a survey, do you support the creation of a Grey Forest National Park to save the leadbeater's possum, and you show them a picture of a fluffy animal, most people will go, oh yeah, all right, no, I suppose, yeah. It brings a tear to your eye, but the reality is it's bigger than that. It's a bigger picture thing. So to go back to how long we've been talking about this, I haven't been in this place for very long, but it's been going on the entire duration that I've been here. Back to the previous government, this government, sorry, when they were opposition under the previous government, they had a policy which they have implemented to set up a task force to look at the forestry industry. And they did that. They set up a task force, and that task force met a couple of times, argued, bickered, probably through foul language and screamed at each other more so than we do in this house, and they stopped meeting. They've done nothing since. They are absolutely opposed. You've put two people in a room who will never agree to what the other one wants to do. Absolutely never agree. There's no middle ground on this. We're dealing with ideology, and for that reason, it's stalled. That task force has stalled. They did, however, come up with a list of things that they wanted to do, things they wanted to achieve. They wanted to put together some things in place that they could do to improve the industry. And no one's disputing that. The industry's not disputing that there's things they can do to improve. Not once have I had a conversation with anyone from the industry saying, we don't want to improve, we don't want to make things better. But there's no middle ground. There's no room to improve and transition when you have someone who is diametrically opposed to it and screaming for it to be ended altogether. And that's why we have a Grey Forest National Park proposal, because it's a blanket wiping out of it. It doesn't move into any other forms of industry. It doesn't transition. It's a blanket wipeout. But also that task force came up with a list of things that they wanted to talk about outside of the industry, which was very curious. When you get a task force set up to look at the forestry industry and you put people in the room from the industry and people who are acting on behalf of the environment, or so they claim, they should be looking at the implications that the industry has on those pieces of land, on those areas, and trying to improve that. But this task force decided that they would take it upon themselves to make recommendations, which they haven't made any. They said they were going to. They touted that they were going to make recommendations on, but they haven't. It's all gone very quiet. But they wanted to make recommendations on new parks and what would happen to land in the event that a timber industry changed their practices and moved out of a certain area. they wanted to make recommendations on what would happen to that land, and I thought it was something that absolutely needed to be brought up at the time, that this is an industry group and an advocacy group for environment purposes getting together talking about the forestry industry. They should not and have no place to be making recommendations on what happens to public land if the industry is not actually in it. There are other processes for doing that, and that's an issue for government, and it's an issue to be discussed in this place. It's not an issue to be discussed in back rooms between unions, industry people and environmentalists. So we brought that to the attention of this House, and it seems to have just gone quiet on that front. Seems that no one really cares what that task force is doing. They weren't doing anything anyway, so it's gone away. Even Ms Dunn knows that they haven't met for a number of months, which is no surprise to anyone, because they're only going to get together and reach the same conclusion they did last time, is that there is no conclusion. They can't reach a middle ground. So that's what the government had a policy of doing. And in essence, that policy is just simply to stall, to buy time. They don't want to go down the path of opposing a Great Forest National Park, because that's politically going to hurt them in inner city seats, where there is a strong support for this park, maybe, by people who have been asked pointed questions about a fluffy animal. But the government's looking towards that political implication, and they don't want to commit either way. They don't want to say no to all of those workers who should be represented by their unions and by a Labor government. They don't want to say to them they're going to impose a Great Forest National Park, but they also don't want to say we're not going to do the Great Forest National Park because that damages their chances of inner city seats. So it's very interesting watching the politics at play behind this issue and how that affects the government's movements. But at the same time, the opposition had a policy going into, well, the current opposition had a policy going into the last election of no new national parks, I've been told, which was a good policy in my eyes. National parks have a number of inherent problems, and we've brought that issue up several times. So it's a good policy to have, but they were pretty quiet on it for a while. And I don't blame them for being quiet on it, because I didn't think this government would be stepping into the realm of entertaining the idea of a Great Forest National Park. But as we go on, it becomes more and more apparent that this government is implementing Greens policies, and it's probably only a matter of time before we see them move on a Great Forest National Park. So I'm glad that the opposition has put this issue to the House again, in order to reinforce that position that there should be no more national parks. Not until we can fix the ones that we've got, not until we can ensure that we can afford them, that we can manage bushfire risk, that we can manage pests. There should be no more national parks. So the SFP at the time, Shooters Fishers Farmers Party now, brought our motion to the Parliament last year, which was supported by the majority of this House, which was great. It was great to see. It showed that there is no appetite in this House for a new national park. It showed that a new national park cannot guarantee to address all of the issues that were raised. And that was really, really great to see, and I hope we get the same, if not better, result today with this motion. Although the last one put forward by myself was calling for an action, and that is in the shape of a moratorium, which I thought was a pretty sensible measure for the government, who is stalling. They're stalling on the issue with this task force, was to put into place a moratorium until they can sort all those things out. That would have worked pretty well. I think it was pretty sensible. This motion, although also is very agreeable, simply opposing the creation of a Great Forest National Park. So we move on from what the opposition and government were doing pre-election, and we go to the Greens, and the Greens have been probably the only party, apart from ourselves, that have been consistent on this, consistently, vehemently supporting a Great Forest National Park, as vehemently as we are opposing it. But they seem to ramp up their advocacy on the issue at very, very pointed times when it suits them. And it's probably, I could forgive everyone in this chamber for not noticing the last attempt by the Greens to ramp up this issue, which was in the lower house of the Parliament, where they put a motion to be discussed as a matter of public interest, Now, the reason I forgive everyone in this chamber for not knowing about it was because we were in the throes of debating the euthanasia bill. That was being forced upon us very quickly in an attempt for the government to get a nice handy announcement on a Saturday morning of a by-election. But it was also a matter for the lower house having time taken up in political point scoring by the Greens, trying to get a handy little announcement for the Northcote by-election. So if anyone wasn't aware there was a by-election on that weekend, you surely have blinkers on. The political point scoring that was being attempted in this place and in the lower house was just phenomenal. But the Greens put it up at that time, right before a Northcote by-election, because they know that in the seat of Northcote and in other seats that they hold, like Melbourne and Prahran, this is an issue where people may support a Great Forest National Park, so they're playing on that. Which is really unfortunate, because this is not an issue for the people of Northcote, Prahran and Melbourne. This should not be an issue for the people of Northcote, Melbourne and Prahran. This is an issue for people in the Central Highlands. This is an issue for people in Gippsland who work in the timber industry. This is an issue for people who will have their lives impacted by the loss of their job, not their lives impacted by getting a warm, fuzzy feeling answering a survey with a picture of a fluffy possum on it. So I was really disappointed to see that attempt in the lower house to try and gain some votes for a by-election. I don't actually know how the procedure works down there. It was something that I only came across in my research for this motion, the mechanism of a matter of public importance in the lower house, but I hope the result was that people threw that idea out as a waste of time, a positive motion towards a Great Forest National Park. So we move to the impacts of the Great Forest National Park and what's trying to be achieved by it. And the Greens and other proponents of this park seem to believe that this is going to bring in a plethora of new jobs to replace the thousands that will be killed off by it. A plethora of new jobs in different areas, in different industries, in different places, by different people in most cases. This would drive different types of tourism to the areas, and the Greens have some utopia idea of pristine national parks, and we do all sorts of other activities out there that's going to create visitation and tourism, and you're going to have parks managers to manage it, and experts in the environment and people who are employed in those spaces, and probably 150 cafes spread out amongst the 355,000 hectares of bush that no one's going to go in to visit a cafe. But the reality is that the jobs that may be created by a national park won't be the same as the jobs that are lost. People have been in jobs in the forestry industry for decades, their entire lives. It's a generational thing. People are entrenched in that industry. It's all they know for a lot of people. And to have that ripped away from them and be forced in a different direction for their life, that may involve retraining. If you're lucky, you might be able to be retrained and get a job as a barista. Probably won't pay the same as a forestry worker. But for many people, you get to a certain age where a major career change isn't an option. You can't just retrain and take up a job as a park manager. You can't retrain and take up as a job as a niche tour guide with bushwalking experiences and bird watching. It just doesn't work like that. We're tearing down a solid foundation of working people and trying to force them in a different direction that it just isn't going to work. It's going to create heartache. It's going to cause all sorts of problems, and these are people that need to be looked after and made sure that they can have jobs and provide for their families, not have them stripped away. But not just the jobs, and that is the focus of Mr. O'Sullivan's motion, is the industry and the jobs that are in that industry and what will be lost. But also the creation of a national park brings about with it a whole set of new rules. They're different rules to what we've got. And the area being proposed by the Great Forest National Park is 355,000 hectares of mostly state forest. There's a few other types of land tenure in there. But they have vastly different rules to what a national park does. And that's the reason national park's been chosen, because one of the rules is will have the implication of canning logging and removing that industry. But but it has a lot of different rules on all sorts of other things, and there will be a number of other recreations that will be outright banned or seriously impacted. Hunting, for example. The area in question in the Central Highlands is one of the most prized areas for deer hunting in the state, probably the country, and it's probably even on the global map as far as a premier deer hunting location. We do a lot of hunting in there. Last year, the numbers that were produced for deer harvested by hunters was up to 100,000, which is an incredible number, absolutely incredible number, and it is some of the wildest, most pristine country, and it's great to have people out and about in those areas pursuing their recreation, but also doing something that will be a benefit to the environment, and that is removing pest animals, or deer, which are one of our premier game species. But that'll be outright banned under a national park. It's very, very difficult to get any type of hunting up in a national park. It's very difficult to have rules changed and bend to allow it, even when it makes sense, even when we're doing it for reasons to protect peatlands in the high country or other areas that are being impacted by invasive species. It's very hard to change those rules in a national park to allow hunting. So this is not going to be an easy task with the creation of a new national park, especially one of that size, and especially one that covers such a vast area of current hunting land. But there's also a number of other activities. Horse riding will be a big issue, and I know a lot of people who run businesses off of horse riding and taking people out on trekking adventures on horseback, and even running businesses packing in and out for hunters into places where you can't get with vehicles. But that'll be impacted by the rules of a national park. Full driving and fishing will be impacted, and a lot of people will yell and scream and say that they won't. But the reality is, when a national park's put in place, there are issues with accessibility. There are always issues with accessibility. Parks Victoria seem to like closing places and making sure no one can go in there. For whatever reason, they tend to justify it by. So full driving and fishing, whilst may not be made illegal, will be severely impacted. You won't be able to walk your dog. It's as simple as that. I'm talking about some specific recreational activities, but you won't be able to walk your dog in this place because it's a national park. You won't be able to go camping in a lot of places. We're seeing now with draft management plans for a number of areas, dispersed camping is frowned upon now by land managers. We're moving towards putting people into designated camping sites. We're moving towards having people pay to use those designated camping sites, and that's been an issue that's getting trotted around at the moment, that these fees are just so we can put in place a booking system, but no, it's just revenue raising. It's revenue raising because we can't pay for the parks we've got. But it happens in national parks more than any other land, where you have camping sites. Parks management will say, you can't camp here, you must camp in this spot, and as a result we're going to charge you for it. So camping's going to be affected. And it seems the only activities that aren't going to be affected by the creation of a national park are those that are Greenie approved. We refer to them as Greenie approved activities. If they don't like it, you're not allowed to do it. If they do like it, it's okay. You can walk in the bush, you can bird watch if you want. I don't know if anyone actually does that. So recreational activities will be impacted, and the examples that I've given today are only very specific examples and only few examples of the wide number of those that will be impacted. And pests will be a problem. Now, pests will run wild in this national park. We've just recently had a government-initiated inquiry that went to a joint committee of the Parliament to inquire into pest management, specifically on the point of using hunters for pest management. So it wasn't a wide-ranging inquiry. However, when you start talking about pest management, people want to talk about all aspects of it, and in some ways it did cover everything from pest species, but also vegetation, and it was really wide-ranging, the information that was provided to that committee, and it made a number of recommendations on changes in which we can make pest management better, and a lot of that was on the back of a recognition that hunters can contribute. In many cases, they can't be the sole management process for most species, but they can make a great positive contribution. With some added benefits of mostly being free. It's a free service provided by volunteers instead of paying someone, because I guarantee you won't be able to pay enough people to make up for the 50,000 licensed game hunters in the state, not including people who just hunt pests and don't have a game licence. We'll never be able to pay for it, so there's a free service being provided that'll keep numbers of pests down in national parks and numbers of deer, which are a game species. So a prohibition on hunting in this area is going to have a drastic impact on the way in which we can manage pests in those areas. We received, I sat on the inquiry that was put to the Joint Committee of the Parliament, and we received lots of information about the differences between certain areas, whether it be state forest or national park, and how in national parks it seems that pests are running rampant, whereas in areas of state forest that are hunted, they seem to be less of a problem. Now, this motion, moving back to it, is very pointed and focused on the industry, and I've talked a bit about some of the other aspects. It's very focused on the industry in that area, namely the timber industry. There are other industries that will be impacted, but it is a real shame that we have to have this discussion about a successful industry, an industry that is thriving, an industry that is sustainable, and an industry that we should be looking to improve, not shut down. And it is an absolute shame that the Greens would have this mentality of trying to shut down an entire industry like that, because they don't want to transition. They don't want to move into something that's better. They just want it gone. Most of the proponents of this proposal come from a background of trying to shut down logging. There's no middle ground with these people. They don't want to negotiate. They've tried with me. They've tried a number of times with me. Tried to incorporate hunting into the plan in an attempt to get me to support it. And we all know it's not going to happen. There's no negotiating. You say to them, take away the national park part of your plan, and we might look at it, because the rules are different with other land tenures, but it doesn't work. So it's an absolute shame that we're having to negotiate on this instead of just moving forward with improving the industry. And we're negotiating it on the back of inner city votes and in Paran and Northcote and places like that, and the political fallout of those at-risk seats. And we're having to negotiate with people's livelihoods. People rely on these jobs. People want jobs to feed their families. These people in these areas are good, hard-working, honest people. And it's easy to sit in this place or sit in a cushy office in Melbourne where your environment group may reside and condemn people for working in this industry. It's easy to do that when your job's not at risk and you're not at risk of losing that job and the ability to feed your family. And it goes back to something I experienced with the debate and the inquiry that I sat on with the coal seam gas issue, where I actually had someone tell me that it was a disgrace that anyone would want to work in that industry. And I was perplexed by that statement. And this person obviously didn't like coal seam gas, but to say it's a disgrace for someone to seek a job, to be a hard-working, decent person and earn a living for their family and not having to rely on welfare, it perplexes me. What I consider a disgrace is to be ideologically moving on these issues to take jobs away from people. That is the disgrace. So we're moving on this. We're having lots of debate about this issue, lots of debate. On the back of ecotourism, and ecotourism is a funny word. I love talking about ecotourism because it doesn't work. It doesn't work when you implement it like the people who want ecotourism want you to. People who want ecotourism, like the Greens, they have this weird view of it, and it's this sort of utopian view of ecotourism that everything's lovely and only the people they want come in and visit these places. But I have to tell you that they're wrong about what ecotourism is, because hunting is ecotourism, horse riding in the bush is ecotourism, four-wheel driving, all those activities that would be banned under a national park are ecotourism. They are people enjoying the wild places of our state, people enjoying being in the bush, and they're using the environment as their place of leisure. Just going camping is ecotourism. It is not restricted to simply activities like bird watching or bushwalking or getting in your Leica and riding your bike. Those aren't the only activities that you can partake in as ecotourism. Now, I've spent a lot of time on wetlands, I've spent weeks and weeks at a time in wetlands. I've spent weekends, too many weekends that I can't count them, in wetlands. And you know who I see in wetlands using them? Duck hunters. They're the only ones. You never see anyone else. You get the occasional ranger come through who's employed to be there, but they're the only people that you see. They're the only people that use those places. Ecotourism, if you were to implement it like the Greens and these environmentalists who want the Great Forest National Park view it, would exclude those people and these places would be only open to bird watchers. And in all my years of spending time on wetlands, I've never seen anyone out there bird watching. Not once. And you go up to the Kerrang Lakes and the areas in northern Victoria where there's a bit of infrastructure that's been built for bird watchers. There are raised platforms and timber walking bridges and things so you can get out on the water without putting a footprint. But I've never seen them worn out. I've seen them rot away. I've seen them just simply rot away, but I've never seen them be worn out. I've never seen them to the point where people have used them and we have to replace them because they're getting too much use. It doesn't work. I've never seen a bird watcher in a swamp at all. And I can't say I've ever had a conversation with someone where I say to them, hey, what do you do for fun? And they say bird watching. Plenty of people I've met, I ask lots of people, I ask people all the time for this exact reason. What do you do for fun? No one says bird watching. No one says it. No one says it. Heaps of people say duck hunting, but no one says bird watching. They're few and far between if they do exist. But I tell you, I've never seen them out actually doing it. But ecotourism only works with a very narrow view. It only works, if you ask the Greens, it only works when certain activities are allowed. And I say to those who want ecotourism in that form, to go and tell that to the people of Barmah. Go and tell that to the people of Barmah who several years ago had their state forest turned into a national park. Go and tell that to those people who were relying on tourism dollars to come in under the guise of ecotourism for the creation of a national park. And what's happened? The national park is mismanaged. Parks don't have enough staff to actually do any management projects in there. They don't have enough money to implement them. And one of the greatest tourism drivers for the area was the Barmah Brumbies. And what have we got now? Now that it's a national park, we have movements by Park Victoria to kill them. They literally want to kill the only thing, or the major thing, that was bringing people into that area for tourism. They literally want to kill them. They're killing off the tourism of that area under the guise of ecotourism. And guess what? When the horses are gone, when those brumbies are gone, now I'm not saying we shouldn't manage them, but when they're gone, no one will go there because you're not allowed to duck hunt either. But they were the only other people that went there. But when those brumbies are gone, you won't be allowed to, you will not go there for anything else. And the people of Barmah are hurting for it. They were promised that the creation of a national park there would bring in ecotourism, and it has not happened. It hasn't happened. So to the people of Barmah, I'll just say that you are one of the main reasons we are opposing the Great Forest National Park. You are the driver, and we are defending the people of the Central Highlands because of what happened to you. And I would just like to make one final point in relation to this motion by Mr O'Sullivan, and that is that recently I was given an answer by the Leader of the Government in this House to a question about the Great Forest National Park proposal and the type of land tenure that was chosen for it, being a national park. And I asked the Leader of the Government, on behalf of the Minister for Environment, whether any other types of land were even looked at, and the answer was really know. And I asked what protections would be provided. In the answer, the Minister said, there are environmental protections that would apply to a species such as the leadbeater's possum, regardless of where they may be found in the landscape. Regardless of where they may be found, whether that's in a national park, whether it's in a state forest, whether it's in Prahran or Northcote, it's probably not likely. Most of the people there have probably never seen one. But protections will be afforded to them regardless of where they are. And for that reason, there is no need for a Great Forest National Park. Thank you, President.